Hey everyone, welcome back. Hope you're doing well out there. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about a pervasive, common underlying pattern that I've been kind of exploring and learning about and discovering that is common to different forms of therapy and is common to psychedelics, and I think is probably an underlying pattern of how the nervous system heals itself. And I'd like to explain that to you in depth so that you can get more acquainted with it so that you can understand this process better. So let's talk about it. So what's this pattern, you may be wondering? So I'd like to describe it to you, but I want to just say before I do that this is one of these topics that unfortunately I don't have a lot of information on that I've seen. This is one of these things that's kind of an observable pattern that I've had to kind of unpack on my own. So this is something I don't have a lot of reference points to that I can point to or kind of fancy words that I can use. So bear with me as I kind of try to describe this experience that I keep seeing, this pattern that I keep seeing with the nervous system in a way that is the best I can do with the metaphors I have here. So this pattern generally looks like an unfolding or an expansion or an unpacking or a moving from inside out. So the way I think about this a lot is that there is this common pattern that we experience with the nervous system that you see across life, really, if you stop and look at it, which is this kind of unfolding of a flower type pattern, or this kind of radiating pattern, or this expanding and unpacking and unfurling of leaves of a tree type pattern. And this is the pattern that I see over and over and over in multiple types of therapy that I've studied and different experiences with coaching and working with the unconscious mind. This is also a pattern that is very self-evident, obvious in psychedelics. And so I want to talk with you guys a bit about how to work with this pattern, how to recognize this pattern in yourself. And the reason I'm bringing this up, the reason why I think it's so key, is that in our healing journey, if we don't recognize that there's a pattern to how our nervous system moves and releases stress, releases information, releases memories, opens up insights, this kind of stuff, if we don't realize that that's what's going to happen or how this rhythm works, we are generally more prone to either suppress stuff that's kind of emerging and coming up as it bubbles up to the surface, or we are more likely to just generally be kind of frightened and overwhelmed and afraid because, as you well know, human beings are generally afraid of the unknown, right? And so there is this dynamic here of working with information that is coming from the unknown to the known, or the layers of the petals of the flower opening up as new layers unfold underneath it, new layers yet unfold underneath that. So there's this pattern going on, and the more we can embrace that as how our nervous system works, the more smoothly we can adapt as things begin to unfold and move. So let's talk about this a little bit more. I do have some nuances I want to add to this conversation. And particularly, I want to describe different kind of metaphors for this. I want to talk a bit about where I've seen this in different forms of therapy and help you to understand a bit more about it. So let's talk about it. Okay, so I'd like to give you a few more descriptors of this kind of pattern of unfolding that I think is really the central rhythm or flow or directionality that the nervous system moves in to move information into our awareness, into our attention. So I've heard this described before as bottom-up change work, if we want to talk about it from a somatic therapy perspective. From a hypnosis perspective, this is the unconscious mind presenting information to the conscious mind. So if the unconscious mind is the sum total of everything we're experiencing that is not in our attention in a current moment, or is the repository of all our memories and experiences and learnings and the deep intelligence of the body and the deep intelligence of our whole system, obviously we're not tapping into most of that most of the time, but sometimes something bubbles up to the surface that is probably relevant to whatever is going on in the moment. So we can think of this as unconscious to conscious movement. think we can also think of this as kind of radiating from the core, like in a more spiritual sense, perhaps, radiating from the core of ourselves to the surface of ourselves, right? From the, if you really want to go there with spiritual language, from the soul to the ego, right? Or from the core to the mind, if you want to think of it that way. And I really think these are all describing that same directionality and that same movement from center out. Again, I think of this pattern of a flower unfolding itself as being a great metaphor, a great visual descriptor of this kind of pattern of movement. And I really do think that this is probably how the nervous system heals itself, moves energy, resolves things, presents things. And there are a lot of different contexts where I've seen this pop up. I think I've mentioned recently in one of my videos about social bids and bids for connection. This is another example of that too. A lot of times our bids for connection from other people is a unconscious thing that comes up as an impulse. In general, I think impulses where we want to reach for something or ask for something or do something, again, is this movement from feeling, from maybe deep desire or perception, into a feeling that moves us to act, that moves us to whatever, do the thing we do impulsively. So there is this recurring theme of from the inside out, from the bottom up, that I hope you're starting to get as I describe it here, is starting to become more clear. I want to talk a little bit about how this applies or where I've seen this in hypnosis, in somatic therapy. I want to talk a bit about how this applies to psychedelics because this is highly, highly relevant to psychedelic use. So let's talk about that a bit. So from a hypnotherapy perspective, one of the things some of my teachers might say is all problems are in the unconscious mind, and that's part of what defines them as a problem. Generally speaking, if we consciously understood what our issue was, we would also consciously understand how to fix it or how to resolve it or where the disconnect there is or where the kind of unresolved question there is, and we could start to find answers to it, find resources to it, find solutions to it. From a somatic therapy perspective, what I've noticed a lot as I'm studying more somatic therapy right now is that as we start to work with a person and what's going on in their nervous system and in their experience, the nervous system starts to recognize that it's being listened to, that it's being attuned to, that it's safe, if it's working with a safe person, and that it can start to therefore let go or express whatever the stress or the wound or the traumatic imprint is and start to bring it into the person's conscious embodied experience, right? So often this turns into like a big release of a traumatic, imprint or memory or moment, a big release of energy in the nervous system, or a sudden aha of realizing what the pattern there was that we've been unclear about, or a sudden release of emotion is another way this goes, or a sudden arising of a resource state that we've been suppressing. So all of that, again, comes from this kind of bottom up, inside out unfolding movement. And, if a person knows to expect that's, part of the nervous system saying, hey, great, you're listening. Great, you're paying attention. I can finally bring this up, right? Then if we know to expect that, we don't get caught off guard with overwhelm and with fear and with terror, quite frankly. We become much more resourced. We know to be present with and curious about what's emerging and what's there and what's kind of murkily hidden there, because it will, reveal itself in the right moment, in the right way for us to start to have a transformation, a healing, a release. I really do believe the more that I do this work, the more that I help people heal and transform and create big changes, the nervous system knows how to self-heal. I really, really align with that. There are certain things I question in some of the ideas of psychedelic therapy, of Stan Grof, or of, some of the MAPS protocols, and some of the ideas I get a little, challenging around. But I think this idea of the inner healing intelligence is pretty self-evidently true to me. And so that's what I think is going on here, is that the inner healing intelligence is bringing from the inside to the surface what needs to be released, let go, seen, connected to, honored, loved, met with compassion, etc. And so that's what's going on, in hypnosis, in somatic therapy. But what about in psychedelic therapy? So have had the same experience over and over and over with psychedelics, because I was obviously doing psychedelics long before I was learning about hypnosis or somatic therapy or of any of the stuff that we're just talking about. And I would have these experiences of these, and it's often wonderful, it's often beautiful, these emergent states, these emergent insights, these emergent aha moments, right? And this is part of what people recreationally using psychedelics love about psychedelics, is that you can just have these waves of, new states, new insights, new experiences over and over and over that are just kind of dawning and arising inside of you over and over and over. It's beautiful. And so this is something I was really familiar with. And if you get kind of deeper into the kind of spiritual side of psychedelics and into spiritual practices, you start to see this pattern of kind of like what might be called the white light in psychedelic work, and that there's kind of these rays of energy that seem to emanate from the white light, and spiritual people would call that source. And there's this central core, this deep, and often people recognize it as being in their heart or in their third eye or at the center of their being is this radiant source, whatever you want to call that. And maybe that's psyche, maybe that's mind, maybe that's soul. I don't know. There are different frameworks and ways we could kind of frame that, but it's a common experience on psychedelics to have this kind of radiant feeling in our core, radiating outward again. So you have the same dynamic going on in psychedelic work. And even, you'll notice with whether it's taking mushrooms or even more dramatically with ayahuasca, what happens is, we have these, what in ayahuasca work would be called purging, right? Where we are moving energy, again, from the depths outward, whether that is literally physically purging out of one end or the other, whether that is purging tears, purging sighs of breath, purging emotions in terms of these waves of feeling and maybe shaking and maybe, just kind of allowing emotion to move through us. Purges of, old ideas that don't fit with us. And all of a sudden we get a clarity and like what was that? That's been kind of in there, et cetera, et cetera. Purges of unconscious beliefs, et cetera. Right. So this is well known in ayahuasca work as something that happens. It's why people take ayahuasca, is to purge. Right. But also you notice this in mushroom work too, where again, you have almost like a feeling of wanting to purge again, or a feeling of the body wanting to offload stress and shake out and tremor out stress, somatically release stress, whether it's crying or again, speaking or talking, or sometimes singing can be a purging, but it's all the same rhythm from the core outward. Whether we're talking, grief and pain and screaming, or singing and praise, or humming, or, et cetera. It really can range in terms of tone and quality, but it's the same movement and the same rhythm. So like I said earlier in the video here, my main reason for bringing this up is I want you to know this consciously. I want you to be attuned to this and aware of this and expect this out of your healing process. And to be totally frank with you, this is something that I see happen even, just outside of psychedelic work, just in my normal work with people as a coach. This is the same channel that insights move through, and ahas and breakthroughs and moments of clarity and moments of motivation and moments of passion. And it's the same pattern over and over and over, right? So my first reason that I want to bring this up to you, why is this important? It's important because when you recognize this, you start to expect it. And then as you expect it, you're more comfortable working with it. Again, this is one of these reasons why it's better to have a therapist or a coach or, a good sitter or someone who's trauma trained potentially, or a good guide, depending on the context and what your needs are. It's good to have someone who knows what they're doing, who can help you navigate this so that you're more grounded, you're less freaked out, as things start emerging through you. Because the temptation and part of what keeps things, stuck for you is to suppress, right? We get something starts to arise in us and we get overwhelmed, spooked by it, suppress it, distract ourselves, stuff it down, that kind of thing, right? And that's exactly what keeps it in the unconscious and keeps us from healing. So first thing that I want you to know is that this happens, and to recognize it and to find peace with it and find comfort with it. The other thing that's implied, though, in understanding this is, okay, the question isn't what's going to happen. The question is, how do we work with what arises, right? And so this starts to reframe our understanding of this work. Okay, now I know this rhythm, I know the dynamic, I know what's going to happen. How do I meet what arises in me, whether it's challenging or wonderful, with compassion, with openness, with curiosity, with kindness, with love, with an open attitude of engaging and accepting whatever shows up, right? So that's the next thing, is that this starts to imply this new mindset. Okay, now that I know something's going to emerge from the unknown to the known inside of me, how do I work with that? And what are the tools I need? What are the skills I need? What's the support I need in order to comfortably, effectively do that? And then the other thing is starting to consider, so there's an implication here, not just about, what's emerging, but where it's emerging from in us, right? So not just tuning into the information in our system that wants to come out or that wants to be expressed or heard or seen or connected to, but also what is the core of us where all of this emerges from. And I think that that's actually a very spiritually kind of, flavored question. That's a deeply profound, interesting thing to start to contemplate, especially on psychedelics, tuning into the core, into that place of whether you want to think of it as expansiveness or silence or clarity or infiniteness or, however you want to think of that. There's a mystery at the center of every human being that all of this information emerges out of, right? And what is that mystery? What is that thing? I don't want to fill in the blanks for you there, but I think it's a really interesting thing to start to think about, because it's so easy as we're getting in touch with this unfolding pattern in ourselves to just look at what's coming out of us and what's unfolding and, be so caught up in the information that we don't stop to look at the more subtle implication here, which is where is this coming from? And what's the intelligence that's there? And how do I feel at that part of my being? How do I feel deep in my core? What's there, right? And I think that's a really beautiful exploration. I think that's really worth looking at and exploring. I want to talk a little bit more about that. So let's talk a little bit more about that, and then we'll just kind of wrap the video here, okay? So along with just tuning into where this is coming from, I want to talk a little bit about the kind of layers that I've noticed tend to happen with our attention. So I'm going to kind of offer a rough model of these layers from the core out. This would be from the center of the flower to the petals, to the tips of the petals, if you will. I'm not saying this is any sort of complete, totally clear-cut model. This is just a rough explanation of some of the layers that I see, okay? This may not be all of them, but I want to just kind of explain this to you and get you thinking about it. So what I've noticed is that for most people who are kind of operating in our default culture, our default conditioning, our default mode, we are mostly putting our attention outward, not even on ourselves, but on what's happening out there materially, physically in the world around us, right? So it's what are the things, what's going on in the world around me, what are the people, what are the narratives, what are the stories, what are the things I want, what are the things I don't want, what's happening out there. So most people's attention aren't even on themselves. Most people's attention is on what's happening out there in the world around us, right? And the most extreme form of that, there are people who are so caught up in what's external that they aren't even aware of their own thinking, right? This is very common. The next layer back, right? So if we're tracing emergence from the most emerged to the most core, right? The next layer back from that is going to be our thoughts, right? And for most of us, if we're talking about therapy, healing, spirituality, awakening, personal transformation, personal development, we are starting to be aware of our own thinking, at very least, right? What are the thoughts that move through my head? Why are these thoughts moving through my head? Obviously, a lot of times when a person, comes to work with someone like me, like a hypnotherapist or like a licensed therapist, they're there because they're like, I'm having these thoughts in my head that fucking suck, right? That's really, I'm being blunt about it and putting kind of a real basic, point on it there. But essentially, we're aware of our thoughts, right? And for a lot of us, that's as far as we trace it back. We go from what's happening out there to what's happening in here at a thought level, right? And then some of us trace that further back into what's happening emotionally inside of me. And for some of us, that's really loud. That's even louder than the thought level. But, what's happening at like an emotional level inside of me, right? What are the feelings? What are the states that are arising in me? And then, a lot of times the thoughts come out of the states. They're meanings we make about feelings we have, right? So then we become more aware of, and that starts to move more into the body, more into the unconscious, more into the felt sense, right? And so we move from what we're aware of externally to our own thoughts to what we're feeling as bodily representations of meaning, right? Which is what emotions are. If we're really paying attention, we might get underneath the bodily representation into what the actual core meaning is. What's the meaning that my nervous system is holding on to or believes is true or has arrived at, And for a lot of us, that's really deep work. That starts to get really profound, right? But again, meaning is not the deepest layer of who you are, what you are. It's also another layer of interpretation making. And if we trace that back further, there's probably, there's different models of this. So I'm not claiming, again, that any of this is totally whole or correct or super accurate. It's just roughly accurate. At the core, there's this deep core experience. In spirituality, they might call that silence or pure consciousness, pure bliss, compassion, love, radiance. They might call that a felt sense of oneness. They might call that a felt sense of being. But there's a core piece. And I think part of this work here that's interesting is to start to become aware of what's unfolding. What are the meanings? What are the insights? What are the things that have been held on to the nervous system? And looking at that, but also looking at our core and the relationship between the two. Because sometimes what's going on is that we have meanings and beliefs and stories and narratives and experiences and perceptions that are stored in our nervous system, learnings, let's call it, experiences, that may conflict with how we feel in our core. And part of the struggle or part of the issue is that that disconnect between our core and this thing that's stuck somewhere in the middle in the unconscious that hasn't fully emerged in the conscious, the dissonance between the two is part of the struggle. And a lot of times we get so caught up on the dissonance and the struggle that we don't notice the subtle core thing there. And what I've experienced a lot with psychedelics is becoming aware of our own core and our own experience of our core, as distinct from our thoughts, as distinct from our emotions, as distinct from our meanings and rationalizations and all of that, is profound and deeply important, I would argue. And so I want to just kind of like plant a seed in your awareness, whoever you are, watching this, to consider all of this, to consider that, okay, if I'm going to go on a healing experience, I'm going to go on a healing journey, there's going to be this kind of unfolding, and even if I go to good therapy and I go to a transformational therapist, or in my case, a hypnotherapist or a good coach even, there's going to be a movement of information from my core that I don't know about to my conscious mind. if I go do ayahuasca, or I go do MDMA therapy, or I go do psilocybin therapy, there's going to be an unfolding. And I want to embrace that, court that, discover how to surf that and work with that and beautifully dance with that in a healing way, and discover the beautiful aspects of myself that are also want to unfold itself, that are kind of wrapped up in all of that. And also perhaps inquire into where all of that is emanating from in the first place. So these are my ideas around unfolding, unpacking the central core healing kind of pattern of the nervous system. I'm sure there's probably more literature on it, perhaps in different schools of therapy, certainly in the world of spirituality, certainly in certain, thoughts about shamanism, I'm sure. But again, I haven't encountered a lot of great descriptors of this. This is just what I see from my raw experience working with people, working with myself, and just really looking at what's going on. So I hope this is useful to you, and I hope this gives you a little comfort and a little reassurance. If you're someone who tends to kind of be a little controlling and a little nervous around the unknown, I want to encourage you to learn to relax into this process and work with this emerging, unfolding, radiating, expanding aspect of our being. Because in my experience, when we work with that and we allow that process to happen, we settle into our nervous system in the most beautiful, healed, healthy, vibrant, wonderfully balanced way. But in order to get there, we have to embrace the unfolding and the unknown and the waves of highs and lows that come with that. So that's my message to you here in this video. And I hope it serves you well. I hope you appreciate it. And please do leave a comment down below if this is useful for you. I'm a terrible YouTuber in that I never ask people really that often to subscribe, comment, all that stuff. But please do. It definitely adds to the algorithm and helps the channel to grow. And if this is valuable to anyone please feel free to forward it to them. And I'll have more content for you guys soon. Take care. Much love to you.